Hi, Julie Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I'm back with another holiday party project, and this is a 3D cookie as well. I love edible surprises, and this project has at least two. The first is that it looks like a holiday party cracker. You know those things you get that you crack open and they have little toys and messages and candies inside? Well, the first surprise is they look like a party cracker, but they're actually cookie. And the second surprise is they are also filled with little surprises, candies and messages and things like that. And I'm going to show you how to make every element of them. This project involves a number of techniques: contouring the dough to create that cylinder shape, dipping the cylinder with royal icing so that it's nicely coated like so, laying down frosting sheets and then spraying, and basically a stenciling and airbrushing technique to put pattern on the cookie, and then laying applique work and some royal icing detailing to do all of the finishing touches. We will also touch on a little bit of fondant work. This is a spin on my ribbon making video where I talk about how to make fondant ribbons. These are little tufts of fondant or sugar dough that are going to be stuffed in the end of the cylinders to create that kind of frilly bow type effect. So all you really need for this project are two cylinders for one cracker and two tufts, and we'll come back to how we make each and every one of these elements. Let's talk first about how to shape the dough. I'm just going to talk to you about how I contoured this particular piece. As I mentioned in one of my earlier videos, I really encourage you to get creative in thinking about what you can shape dough around to create unique shapes. I often work with common household elements, this being the one that I use to shape the cylinders. This whisk has a 1-inch handle, and it was just the perfect size for these cylinders. So again, I'm shaping it in halves, and I'm going to piece the two halves together. I ended up rolling out a rectangle of gingerbread dough. My recipe's in the video link. It was about 4.5 inches long, just short of the handle, slightly in length, and about 2 inches wide, so it wraps around half of the circumference. To keep this from falling over in the oven, I rested this on a cookie sheet on a little bit of foil just to keep the whisk from rolling, because if it rolls, the dough will fall off and be lopsided. Okay? So bake as usual. When it comes out, I let it cool slightly just till I can handle the whisk with a pot holder, and then I gently twist this off the end of the handle and possibly squeeze it a little bit together if it misshapes when it comes off. Let it cool completely and you end up with a cylinder like so. So pretty easy, actually. Then the next step, and I'm just going to talk this through, is actually dipping the cylinder. I want to coat it with royal icing. I have a whole video on dipping where I show how to do this. I actually kind of do a rotating motion with this as well, where I start on one side and dip it through the icing like so, and then set it off to drain. And if you look back at my snow globe video, I dip actually a ring-shaped cookie in there, and the motion's very similar, the dipping of it, the sort of rotating of it through the icing. I want to first make sure these are a nice fit together before I do any decorative work on them, and that they fit nice and flush together, because once all the decorations are on, if you try to get them to fit better by filing or shaping them, you're going to probably rub all those decorations off. So typically when they come out of the oven, the edges are uneven like so. It might not be a great fit. There might be some holes somewhere. So after dipping, I will come in. I do this after dipping because if you do it beforehand, dipping will add some unevenness to the bottom edge too. So once it's completely dry, I'll just take it over sandpaper if these are not for eating, which they are, or over a large planed grater for eating, food safe item, and just plane down the edges like this so they're perfectly smooth and these fit beautifully together. I'm really trying to minimize the seam here because I want it to look really like a cylinder. So I may not even put a border along there if the seam ends up being, small enough. Ultimately, what we're going to end up with is a cylinder that looks something like this. We're stenciling gold. Then I'm going to come back in, lay down some frosting sheet pieces directly, these little silver pieces, and then lay all the other beadwork. Okay, for stenciling, I'm using a new technique that I believe I developed, which is stenciling on contoured surfaces using frosting sheets. Most stencils are made out of acetate or acrylic. It's not very bendable, so if you try to wrap normal stencils you'd get around something of this shape, they just pop right up. So I came up with this idea of punching patterns into frosting sheets because frosting sheets are very flexible, and using them as the actual stencil, then taking them off the cookie. You could also apply frosting sheets directly to these pieces as we did in the snow globe project, where I stuck these down directly and that became integral to the cookie and part of the decoration. But if you don't love frosting sheets, this stenciling approach is another way of imparting the same pattern without having the paper on the cookie. So as in some of my previous videos, I used some handy dandy craft paper punches to create these fancy shapes. And if you want to see how I cut with some of these particular ones, I would refer you also back to the snow globe video. I used this particular punch in that one. I've got these pieces all pre-punched. For stenciling, I don't want to stick it down completely with corn syrup because I'll never get that paper back off. So I'm just going to be spraying through that paper to create the pattern. But I do want to tack it down a little bit with corn syrup because in the airbrushing or spraying process, the spray comes out with some force and it may actually take the paper off with it if I don't. So I'm going to anchor one of these on the ends and I'm just going to tack it with a little bit of corn syrup at the very edge where the seam is, just to keep that stencil down during the spraying process. And I like to spray on something, I like to have the piece sort of elevated as it is here. Actually, I'm going to cut off some of this extra that I know I'm not going to need. It's kind of weighing things down. I like to airbrush on something elevated because it's easier just to get the sides of the piece if it's not sitting flush on a surface. So that's why I got it sitting up on this little mini cake pan, if you were wondering. Okay, so I've got all the stencil elements down now. So I've got this different shape in the middle that's going to create this sort of geometric pattern and these two floral pieces on the end. And I'm just trying to get them symmetrically aligned here. I just tacked them with a little corn syrup down here and here. You may wonder why it changed from the cake pan I was on to this little bowl. I did so because there's more clear, this is narrower and there's more clearance on the end. I was having trouble with, when I was resting this on the cake pan, of it lifting the stencil back up when I sat it back down. So no matter how much corn syrup I put on there, the stencil was lifting. And I find that the more overhang there is, the better that stencil will stay down on the ends. Now I'm ready to spray. I'm not going to use my airbrush. I'm going to use a PME, either a PME gold luster spray or a Chef Master gold spray. They're different brands. And these are more readily available if you don't have an airbrush, but you could airbrush just as well. Just to comment on the golds, the Chef Master Gold dries more yellow and matte, I would say, than the PME Gold. And the PME Gold is the color that I actually used on these over here. You can see it's a little more shiny. So again, you might want to test sprays on surfaces before you actually use them. They change color and they look different. They reveal differently on different colored underlying icing too. So I tend to like the PME better, at least on this particular color, because it's more shiny and it's just prettier. But on some other applications, the Gold Chef Master, the yellow hue to it, shows up better. So it's just a matter of trying it out and testing it. I'm just checking one last time that everything's nice and down and flat, because if any parts of the stencil are lifting, the spray is going to get under it and you're going to get a less clean stencil. You want to shake this first, make sure it's well mixed. Usually I use a higher backdrop. I also usually wear a mask. And there are also little hoods you can put this into spray into, because anything aerosolized isn't probably great to inhale over long term. So here we go. Oh, see how that spattered? Not good. Some of these are more prone to spattering. So I'm going to change my luster sprays to the PME. The other one was dripping. And get it going before you start on your product to make sure it's spraying nice and evenly. And I try to keep it as vertical to the surface as possible. I'm trying to get down here now around the sides. I'm going to go back over the side that's spattered and see if I can cover that up a little bit. Just conceal it. See the spatters from the other leaking container? So there's a mistake, but I think if we go over it with a heavier coating, it may not be as obvious. We're going to be decorating that with other things as well, so it may not be the end of the world. Now I'd let that dry a little bit. I'm going to wipe my hands off before I remove the stencils, just so I don't smudge any underlying color that's still wet, and then carefully remove these pieces. You see what a nice effect that has. And actually that big drip right there, hopefully I'll come through with the decoration and we can hide a lot of that. I often say cookie decorating is the art of masking mistakes, and I do a lot of that. So it's a little, I just got to pull a little extra hard at the bottom where it's stuck with the corn syrup. I am back to decorating on my little cake pan because it's got a little more stability. And the next step is laying some actual frosting sheet pieces. I wanted some sparkle, real sparkle to this. And frosting sheets actually come not just white and colored, but also with a little bit of glitter. There's a nice silver glitter and a gold glitter one. So I've cut a few little strips. This one's about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to use them to kind of sharpen up the edges a little bit. So again, these just go down with a little bit of corn syrup. Just enough to make it tacky. You don't want it wet. I'm going to put these fatter ones on the edge. And I've waited just long enough for my airbrush spray to dry so I don't smudge it in the process of doing this. I just want to make sure I'm looking at it from front and back to make sure it's going down nicely at the seams. When you have too much corn syrup on there, it also tends to move around. I cut these pieces on a paper cutter just so I could get them nice and straight. Except possibly not this one. This one's a little wavy. So again, many different ways to decorate these. You could pipe them, paint them. I'm just showing you one possibility. And once these are done, I'll trim off the excess. I'm using slightly smaller ones to come down this zone here to kind of break up that area. These are maybe 1/8 of an inch across. And just as a frame of reference, this is the one down here. That's what I'm trying to replicate. Here I'm cutting pretty flush to the area that I filed. I don't want to really wrap the paper underneath because that'll interfere with getting a really tight seam later. So I'm cutting really flush up to the end. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now let me clear that off and come back with the royal icing applique. And that's just going to be a process like we did on the snow globes of sticking down some beads that you can find out how to make in my royal icing transfer video with a little bit of thick royal icing glue. And I've got white and purple that I'm just going to alternate down the center. These purple ones are a little different than the ones I have on this finished piece because these have been treated with a little bit of luster spray, so they're kind of a lighter purple. These were actually shined up with a little bit of corn syrup, so you can treat them in different ways. And it's easier for me to hold the cylinder while I'm sticking the bead on so that I make sure that way the cylinder doesn't move and I can make sure that bead is tightly anchored. And then in between I'm going to use white ones. So this is a slightly different look than the one on the ground just because the beads are a slightly different color. But the same general process. Now we're ready to do the beadwork, which are those large dark purple beads and the large white beads and the tiny ones in the middle. And for that, as always, I use an icing of beadwork consistency. Got a thick, rather dark purple here. I'm going to go and do that edging first. And you don't really have to allow much dry time between applying a frosting sheet and putting icing near it. With wafer paper you do, because wafer paper tends to buckle when something wet gets near it. So it would need that medium would need more drying time than this does before I could do this. And I'm just kind of looking from the side to make sure my beads are going down nice and uniformly on the side. This is a piece that I'm not sure it helps to elevate because I'm also piping on the top of it as well as the sides. So I've got to kind of see it from every angle. So I'm going to crouch here a little bit as I go around the side to make sure it's looking nice and even. And here I'm not opening up the cone anymore. I'm just not applying any pressure and I can get a very different size bead. Much smaller. Just touching the tip to the surface. So I'm back. I've got 2 fully dried cylinder sides, and I'm ready to begin the assembly process. I like to work on bubble wrap because the one decorated side is going to be face down, and that way I'm less likely to disrupt the designs. I chose a top and a bottom because there will be a seam on this. You know, I want the slightly bigger element, if there is one, to be facing up so you don't see the seam as much from the top. I also marked the ends to ensure the best fit. You know, did it fit better this way or that way? And it fit better this way. So that's the way I'm going to do. And you can see it's a pretty tight seam from the side, nicely matched up. So I'm just going to glue them together. And I probably am not going to put a border down that seam on the outside. You could if you really wanted to hide the seam, but I feel like it might almost accentuate it more. So this is my thick royal icing glue. I'm using white. You could also use light blue. You could match the icing color, but not much of this is going to show, one hopes, so if at all. And I'm just setting it on top, making sure everything's in alignment side to side, pressing it gently together. And then, again, if you wanted to cover that seam, you could. I'm not going to. Chances are I'm going to present them, you know, mostly, you know, on a plate or that next to each other, so those seams wouldn't be that visible. But you could. And I'm going to set that aside to dry. I'm going to show you how now I make the tuft, the end pieces. These are going to stick in here to close it off. I'm going to show you how I made those. You could make these tufty end pieces with just tissue paper if you wanted to, but I like the thought of everything being fully edible. So I'm working with rolled fondant, and I'm just going to try to replicate this. I rolled out a bit of gold fondant, which is a mixture of yellow and brown mixed into the fondant, to the number 2 setting on my pasta machine. You could also roll it out to a very thin thickness. This is maybe a 1/16 of an inch, just with a rolling pin. And I'm going to use this fluted pizza wheel just to give a little nice ruffled edge to this. It doesn't really matter how wide it is. This is a couple of inches because I'm going to be pinching off a lot of the bottom. I like to have a little extra for pinch because that'll insert into the cylinder more easily. So I'd rather have more than less. I start by folding it in kind of to create a point, and then just kind of easing the rest of it around, pinching the bottom as I go to make kind of a rosette, if you will. Now I'm pinching off the extra here, but I am going to leave some to fit into the cylinder later. And I want to open it up a little bit more. One way to allow it to dry more open rather than laying it on its side is to set it into these little hemisphere molds or some little cup and just let it, you know, open it up a little bit and then set it aside to dry. This piece I actually would do the day before, so they're nicely set up before I want to stick them in the cylinder, because if they're too malleable, they'll just smush when you try to insert them into the cylinder later. Once dry, I just sprayed this with the luster sprays that we've been using, the same stuff that I stenciled with. I sprayed first with a silver to get this kind of darkish gray silver accent. Then I sprayed the whole thing with a pearl sheen to get kind of this more subtle hue. And then I came in and I sponged the edge with my gold luster dust. And I'm going to show you how I did that. I'll just redo that one here for you. Got my gold luster powder. Just going to knock a little bit into this lid that I use as a palette. And this is the same process pretty much that I used to sponge gold luster on the embossed cookies in my cookie box project that I recently did. Except that I'm only going to hit the edge. You could use your regular paintbrush, but chances are some bit of the brush is going to hit lower on the edge than you might like. So the sponge brush is nice for this technique because it just gets the top as long as you sponge kind of perpendicular to the edge. Let me do it on here so you see how you get a nice edge on that. Just adds a little sparkle. And since these are for New Year's, it just creates a little bit of extra pizzazz. I'm gonna clean up a little bit, come back and show you how to put it all together with the candy inside. Okay, my tufts are all dry. They've been spritzed with my luster spray and edged with gold luster dust, and I'm ready to put them all together. So my first step is just orienting these tufts the way I want them to be in the final project. I like a lot of the fold facing forward, and this is my front. So I like that situation there. And the reason you might want to do that is because if you have a lot of extra on the end that doesn't allow clearance in the orientation you want it to go, you may just need to pull some off, so it's good to know. Okay, now you can sometimes just take your royal icing glue put a bunch on the end and just glue it to the inside. But I want this to have a little more lift, so in this case I'm going to stick a little bit of the gold fondant in there to anchor it as well. This is soft fondant now. This hasn't been allowed to dry. And that just gives it a little more something to grab onto and will hopefully allow it to sit right a little higher in there. I think that's good. So now it's stuck in, and then the next step before I anchor the other side in place, which I want in that direction, is to fill it. And I'm not lifting it, you'll notice at all now, until everything's completely dry, including those end pieces. I'm going to put in a little Happy New Year's message. These I just printed out on my printer on wafer paper, so that too is edible. And I might need to roll it up to get it to fit in there nicely. It's a little long. And we'll toss a few candies in there as well. I've got M&Ms, some really color coordinated things. I'm not going to fill it too full. You don't want it too heavy or the thing will pop open. Just enough to give a little surprise when people do ultimately break into it. So I'm just kind of tucking them in with my finger. And now I'm just going to seal off this end the same way that I did the other one, probably with a little bit of fondant to anchor it in place and to hold that bow exactly where I want it. So I'm putting a little glue down, putting a little ball of fondant there. So a little bit of glue also to the base of this little tuft here so that it makes contact with that fondant inside. And make sure it's in the position you want it before you set it off aside to dry completely. And then when I want to twist it a little bit this way so it looks more symmetrical. And then when you're ready to serve, you could add the added detail of just tying little bows at the end like I did on this one. Or you could just leave it as it is. But I'd rest them on a plate. They make a great sort of welcome gift to the table, a great sort of place card. Or you could just put them in a beautiful array as a centerpiece on your holiday table. I have yet another 3D video for you, but we're going to be working in cast sugar next. It's a New Year's project as well. Till then, live sweetly.